My brother's blood still stained the wooden floor when my father turned those empty eyes towards me and said I was the only thing left of his family. That's when I understood my real nightmare was only beginning. Before I start, I'd like to know where you're watching my life story from. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like this video. My name is Elaine Marie Carter, but everyone here in Mill Ridge, this little spot in the middle of nowhere in rural West Virginia, knows me as Grandma Dee, the old lady selling homemade pies at the Sunday farmers market. I'm 84 years old, with hair as white as cotton and hands calloused from decades of hard work. Those who see me today, always smiling and giving treats to children, can't imagine the story of pain and resilience I carry in my heart. I was born in 1941 in a simple wooden house on a small farm about 5 miles from town. Our property wasn't much, about 30 acres, mostly tough scrub land, but with some good soil for planting corn, beans and potatoes when the rains came at the right time. We also had some cattle, chickens pecking around the yard, and an old mule named Dusty who pulled our wagon when we went into town. My father, Henry Carter, was a hard man of few words and many demands. From an early age he taught my brother James to work the land and handle the small businesses he ran. They started with a roadside stand at the entrance to our property, then a small feed store that served the neighbours, and finally a hardware store in town. James was his pride, his mirror image, his continuation in this world. A man who doesn't leave a son to follow in his footsteps is like a tree without roots, leaves no mark on this world, was what Daddy always said when he'd had a few whiskies after dinner and started philosophizing about life. My role was to help Mama with housework, learn to cook, sew, make soap and preserves. For a woman to have value, she needs to know how to keep a house proper and please her husband. My mother Martha would teach me, always with her head down, agreeing with everything that came from my father. James was 10 years older than me, a handsome young man with an easy smile and the slanted eyes he'd inherited from our grandmother, who they said had Cherokee blood. Unlike father, he was kind to me, brought candy from town, taught me to whistle, told ghost stories that made me sleep with the blanket pulled up to my neck on winter nights. When I inherit all this, I'll take care of you, Dee. I'll build you a pretty house with a big porch and a kitchen full of cookware, he promised. But fate is a treacherous beast that doesn't respect plans or promises. In 1958, when I was 17 and James was 27, measles swept through our region like a storm, taking down people everywhere. First the school children, then the adults who'd never had the disease when they were young. James was one of them. At first it was just a fever, some red spots on his face. It's nothing, he'd say, stubborn like father, refusing to stay in bed. He kept working at the store, getting rained on, not sleeping well. In 3 days the fever rose so high he began delirious, calling for people who weren't there, screaming that his back was on fire. Father finally agreed to take him to town, but the road was a muddy mess because of the rains. The Jeep got stuck twice. When we finally reached the clinic, the doctor just shook his head. "This one's got pneumonia on top of the measles. I'll do what I can, but it's bad." 3 days later, James left this world in a stuffy room that smelled of medicine and suffering. He didn't even have the strength to say goodbye properly. He just squeezed my hand, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Take care of Mum, Daddy," and was gone, taking all my father's dreams with him. The funeral was quick, as everything is in small towns. The simple pine coffin was lowered into the red clay of the municipal cemetery, while the pastor mumbled some hurried prayers. Father didn't shed a single tear. He just stood there like a cement statue, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the hole, swallowing his only son. Mamma sobbed quietly, leaning on me, her legs weakening with each shovel full of dirt that fell. We returned home in a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate even our thoughts. I didn't know yet, but that silence was just the calm before the storm. For a week, Father barely left his room. He hardly ate, didn't speak to anyone. I would hear him pacing back and forth during the night, the floorboards creaking under his heavy steps. Occasionally, the sound of glass clinking indicated he was drinking from the bottle he kept hidden in the closet. On the 7th night after the funeral, I woke to a crash. I ran to the living room in my nightgown and found Father standing in the middle of the house, the dinner table overturned, plates broken on the floor, and blood. That blood I'll never forget, streaming from a cut on his hand where a piece of glass had gone deep. "It doesn't make sense anymore," he shouted, his eyes glazed like those of a wounded animal. "Why build? Why work? Why save if I have no one to leave it to?" Mama tried to calm him, speaking softly, approaching slowly like someone approaching an angry dog. "We have the girl, Henry. We have Dee." That's when he turned those empty eyes to me and uttered the phrase that would change my life forever. That one. "What's a woman going to do with everything I've built? She'll just hand it over to the first man who comes along. No, Martha, I only have her now, and she'll have to serve a purpose." A chill ran up my spine. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that, but something inside me, perhaps the same instinct that makes a bird fly before the snake strikes, warned me I was in danger. That same night, while cleaning up the mess Father had made, I whispered quietly to those of you following along, "If you can leave a comment saying where you're watching this video from, it gives me strength knowing there are people listening after so many years of keeping this story inside me. Give a like too, so this account can reach more people who might need to hear that it's possible to survive even the worst nightmares." In the days that followed, Father began to change. He would look at me strangely during meals. He started demanding that I learn about the business, that I accompany him to the store in town, that I understand accounts, buying and selling, inventory. "If you're going to inherit all this, you need to know how to take care of it," he would say. But there was no concern in those words, only contained rage, as if each explanation was an accusation. "You're not James, you'll never be." At night, after dinner, he began to drink more than usual. The whiskey that was once just a sip or two became 1 or 2 entire bottles, and with the drink came violence. First against objects, breaking things, punching walls, kicking doors, then against my mother. A shove here, a slap there, always followed by senseless accusations. "It was your fault. You didn't take care of him properly when he was little. You made him weak." Mama would just lower her head and accept it all as if she deserved it. I tried to interfere, put myself between them, got some pushes too, but nothing compared to what was to come. 3 weeks after James's funeral, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my door creaking. At first I thought it was Mama, who sometimes came to cover me when the nights got cold, but the strong smell of whiskey and sweat immediately alerted me. It was my father, stumbling in the darkness, approaching my bed. "James," he called softly, his voice slurred from drinking. "My son," I froze in fear, pretending to be asleep, praying he would realize his mistake and leave. But he sat on the edge of the bed, the straw mattress sinking under his weight, and ran his hand through my hair. "You've come back," he murmured. "I knew you would come back when I tried to move to say I was Elaine, not James." He grabbed my arm hard. "No, don't leave again. You're all I have." What happened that dark night with the wind howling through the cracks in the window and the crickets singing outside was the beginning of a torment that would last almost 2 years. A torment no 17-year-old girl should experience, especially at the hands of someone who should protect her. When the sun rose, bringing the clarity that drives away the monsters of the night, my father had already returned to his room, leaving behind a girl broken inside, crying silently so as not to wake the house. I couldn't get up to make coffee as usual. I lay there, wrapped in the blood-stained sheet, ashamed and wishing the earth would swallow me up as it had swallowed my brother. It was Mamma who came into the room hours later, worried about my absence. One look was all it took for her to understand, her eyes filled with tears. She brought her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob, but she said nothing. She just sat on the edge of the bed and held my hand for a long time. "He's sick with grief, child," she finally whispered, as if that explained or justified what had happened. "Lost his mind with James's death. It will pass." But it didn't pass. That was just the first of many nights when the monster I once called father would enter my room, sometimes calling me James, other times knowing very well who I was, but saying terrible things, that I had to be good for something, that it was my obligation to replace the son he lost, that I owed him this for raising me. And so began my torment in a house that was once home and had now become a prison, with a man whom grief and whiskey had transformed into a monster, and a mother who, out of fear or helplessness, pretended not to see what was happening under her own roof. The pain of those days still tightens my chest when I remember, even after so many years. It seems like it was yesterday, not 1958, that my life turned upside down with James's death. The days passed, and father got worse and worse, like a fruit rotting from the inside out. In the first few weeks he still pretended when outsiders were around, putting on that mask of the respectable family man, devastated by the loss of his son. The neighbours would bring food, coffee, a word of comfort. The pastor would show up now and then to say a rosary, to say that God knows what he's doing. Those things pastors say when they don't know what to say. No one suspected what happened when the door closed, and there were just the three of us in that isolated house. I remember one Sunday when Mr. Anderson, the owner of the general store in town, came with his whole family for a visit. They even brought a cornbread that his wife had made. Father received them all politely, offered coffee, talked about the weather, the crops, how difficult it was to run the store without James. I stayed quiet in a corner serving the visitors, avoiding looking at anyone. When Mr. Anderson asked if I was going to take over the family business, Father gave a yellow smile. "What does a woman know about business, Mr. Anderson? She'll help me until I find a worthy son-in-law, then I'll pass everything to him to take care of." In those days, people thought that kind of thing was normal. Nobody questioned it. Mr. Anderson's oldest daughter even commented that I looked worn out, but her mother quickly cut her off. "It's grief for her brother, girl. Leave her be." If they knew the real reason for the deep circles under my eyes, for the frightened way I had of shrinking when someone came too close. It was in that July of 1958 that Father had his first real breakdown, the kind that even the most distant neighbours found out about. It was corn harvest time, and he had hired some day labourers to help in the field. Early one morning, one of the men, Curly Joe, came to the house to report that he had found part of the crop destroyed with all the ears on the ground, as if someone had deliberately pulled them up. Father turned white as paper, began to shake, his eyes bulging, and suddenly let out a scream that must have scared even the souls in purgatory. It was him. It was James. He's angry with me. He ran out into the middle of the plantation, knocking down more corn along the way, screaming my brother's name, begging forgiveness, saying things that made no sense. The men had to forcibly restrain him, bring him back to the house. It turned out it was just a herd of wild boars that had invaded the field during the night, but in Father's disturbed mind, it was a sign from beyond. After this episode, his madness became increasingly difficult to hide. At the hardware store in town, he would yell at customers thinking they were trying to cheat him. He accused employees of theft without any proof. He began to see James's shadow everywhere, behind the stacks of bricks in the dark corners of the warehouse, hidden among the bags of cement. It wasn't long before customers began to dwindle. Nobody wanted to do business with a man who would suddenly start talking to the air, who would drop merchandise on the floor in fits of rage, who one day would sell on credit with smiles, and the next day threatened the same customer with a knife if they came to collect change. It was around this time that the town pharmacist, Mr. Evans, prescribed a medicine for Father, some white pills that came in a dark vial with a Latin label. It was to calm the nerves, he said. Mama tried to make Father take it secretly in his coffee, but he always suspected. "Trying to poison me, woman? Think I don't know what you and your daughter are plotting?" On one of these occasions, he threw the hot coffee in Mama's face. The burn left a red mark on her cheek that never properly healed. Even so, she continued to protect him, telling others that it wasn't his fault, that it was the pain of loss that had taken his mind. "Martha, why don't we leave here?" I asked softly. One night, while we were putting lard on her back where a belt had left purple welts, "We could go to Aunt Virginia's in Charleston. You yourself say she's always inviting us." Mama just shook her head, eyes downcast, her voice almost gone. "And leave your father like this sick? What will others think?" "No, girl, a man is a man. We have to endure. God wanted it this way." She paused, ran her hand over her tired face. "Besides, where would I go with a daughter?" "A daughter who's no longer fit to marry." Those words cut deeper than any belt. Mama knew what happened on the nights when Father entered my room. She knew and did nothing. Worse, she thought the shame was mine, not his. In those days, a girl who was no longer a virgin, regardless of the reason, was considered spoiled, used. Who would want to marry her? And without marriage, what future did she have? I swallowed the tears and the hatred that was beginning to grow inside me. Hatred not just of Father, but also of Mama, of life, of God, of everything and everyone that allowed this to happen. With the town business slowly failing, Father began to spend more time at home, which only made things worse. Now I feared not only the nights but the days as well. Any moment Mama went out to fetch water from the well, to pick a vegetable from the garden, to hang laundry on the line, he could appear. That smell of cheap whiskey announcing his arrival even before the heavy footsteps. "You look just like your mother when she was young," he would sometimes say, with a look that chilled my soul. "But you have James's determined way." "Yes, there's a little piece of him in you. I always knew it." At the end of 1958, I discovered I had a baby growing inside me. For almost 2 months I hid it as best I could. I wore loose clothes, tied tight bands around my belly, avoided eating too much in front of others to prevent vomiting afterward. But a woman's body doesn't keep that kind of secret for long. It was Mama who noticed first, of course. She was watching me take a bath in the back room, where we had an improvised tin shower. She entered without knocking, as she always did, and stood looking at my belly, which was already beginning to show a small bulge. "How long?" she asked, her voice dry. "About 2 months, I think." She was silent for such a long time. I thought she had turned to stone right there, the old towel in her hand, her eyes fixed on my belly. "Your father can't know," she finally said, more to herself than to me. "He'll kill us, kill all 3 of us." It was the first time I saw Mama openly admit that Father was dangerous, that he could do something worse than he had already done. "And what are we going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling, my hands instinctively covering my belly. "There's a woman in Coal Hollow, old Mrs. Jensen. She takes care of these kinds of problems." My blood froze in my veins. I had heard stories about old Mrs. Jensen, women who went to her and came back carried, bleeding, some never able to have children again, others never came back at all. "No, Mama, I won't do that. It's my child, your child, girl, child of sin, that's what it is." "Fruit of an abomination!" she shouted, losing control for the first time. "You want to raise a monster born of this thing that happens between you and your father? Want the child to be born twisted with a tail with horns?" The superstitions of the time were that strong. It was believed that children born of relations between close relatives were cursed, marked by sin. "I don't know, Mamma. I just know I won't kill my child before it has a chance to be born." The conversation ended there with Mama leaving, slamming the door, and me crying alone, the cold shower water mixing with my hot tears. In the weeks that followed, Mama tried everything. Pennyroyal tea, cinnamon tea, hot baths. She made me jump from stools, carry heavy buckets of water, all in the hope of ending that pregnancy. Nothing worked. Surprisingly, Father noticed nothing. He was increasingly lost in his own madness, talking to James as if he were sitting at the table, fighting with invisible enemies, spending entire days locked in his room with his bottles and his personal demons. It was on Christmas Eve of 1958 that everything exploded. Father had gone to town and returned more drunk than usual, carrying a package under his arm. He called everyone into the living room, including the 2 employees who still remained on the farm. Old Limping Joe, who took care of the cattle, and Nellie, who helped Mama in the house. "Today is a special day," he announced, staggering, his voice slurred from drinking. "Today my son James is going to get a present." He opened the package and took out a pair of new leather boots, the expensive kind that only landowners wore. Boots that would never fit the feet of a dead man buried for months. "Where is he? Where's my son?" Father began to shout, looking around as if he expected James to suddenly appear. "I know he's here. I can smell him." Old Limping Joe tried to calm him, to say that James had died, that he should rest a bit. Father grabbed the kerosene lamp that illuminated the room and threw it in the old man's direction. Luckily, he ducked in time. The lamp exploded against the wall, the fire spreading rapidly over the old dry wallpaper. In a matter of minutes, the room was in flames. We all ran outside except Father, who continued shouting James's name, saying he was going to save his son from the flames. It was Nellie who ran back in and pulled Father out before the roof collapsed. He came out twisting his singed clothes, his hair burned, but alive. We could do nothing but watch our house turn to ashes. The well was too far away, and even if we had enough water, the fire had already taken over everything. We lost almost everything that night. Furniture, clothes, memories, what little money we still had saved in a tin buried under my parents' bed. We spent the rest of the night in the barn, huddled on the straw, covered with the few rags Limping Joe managed to gather. The saddest Christmas I've ever experienced. The next morning, still in shock, looking at the smoking ruins of what had been our home, Mama finally made a decision she should have made a long time ago. "It's over, Henry," she said, her voice firm as I had never heard it. "You need help." We all need help. Father was sitting on a wooden stump, his empty eyes staring at nothing. All the fire of the previous night's rage replaced by a frightening apathy. He didn't even respond. "We're going to my sister's in Charleston," Mama continued. "There's a real doctor there, there's a hospital. You'll get better, and we'll start over." Whether it was the sight of the destroyed house, the shock of almost dying in the fire, or simply the exhaustion of fighting his own demons, I don't know, but Father just nodded weakly like a child. 2 days later, we were on a rattling bus heading to Charleston, leaving behind the ruins of our previous life and James's grave. The only thing Father insisted on visiting before departing. What we didn't know was that we were just trading one hell for another. In Charleston, away from the land where he grew up, away from the grave of the son he loved so much, Father would get even worse, and I, with a belly growing each day, was more vulnerable than ever. It was there, in that strange city in Aunt Virginia's cramped house, that I learned that sometimes you have to kill a part of yourself to survive. It was there that I began to plan my revenge. Not a revenge of blood or fire, but something much more devastating. Charleston wasn't the paradise Mama promised. Aunt Virginia's house was cramped. A small 2-story on the back street of the market, where the smell of dried meat and tanned leather came through the windows along with the dust and noise of the street vendors. We were 4 people squeezed into 2 small rooms, Aunt Virginia in hers and the 3 of us in the other. I didn't even have privacy to cry alone. Aunt Virginia was the opposite of Mama. Widowed for years, she ran a small notion shop on her own and had an opinion about everything. She was the first to notice my belly, which was already becoming difficult to hide. "Martha, is this girl expecting a child, or am I going blind?" she asked one afternoon while I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. The silence that followed weighed more than lead. Mama looked at the floor, her trembling hands creasing her apron. "Well, yes, my sister. The disgrace is complete." "And who's the father?" Aunt Virginia asked, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Another silence, even heavier. "She won't say," Mama lied, her voice almost gone. "One of the farm workers, I think." Aunt Virginia looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see through people. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she didn't believe Mamma. The following week, without telling anyone, she came home with a man in a black suit with a leather bag under his arm. A real doctor, not those healers we consulted back in the country. "Dr. Wilson is going to examine Henry," she announced. And then Elaine, "I don't want anyone sick in my house." Father, who spent his days sitting on a bench in the yard, staring at nothing and talking to himself, barely reacted when the doctor examined him. He answered some questions in a weak voice, let them measure his pressure, look at his tongue, tap his knees with that rubber hammer. Then it was my turn. Mamma tried to stay in the room, but Aunt Virginia was firm. "Let the doctor work, Martha. Go make some coffee for us. Alone with the doctor." I trembled with fear. I had never been examined like this by a strange man, especially in the state I was in. But Dr. Wilson was gentle, respectful, explaining everything he was going to do before doing it. When he finished the examination, his eyes had a sadness that made me lower mine. "Do you know who the father is?" he asked softly. I shook my head, denying it. I was too ashamed to tell the truth. "How far along are you?" "About 4 months, I think." "And do you want to keep the pregnancy?" The question caught me by surprise. No one had asked me that before. Mamma simply assumed I should get rid of the child. Father didn't know, or pretended not to know. And here was this man treating the decision as if it were mine alone. "I do," I answered softly but firmly. He nodded, wrote something on a paper, and gave it to me. "These are vitamins. You're weak, anemic. You need to eat better for the baby." When we left the room, Mama and Aunt Virginia were waiting in the living room, as tense as 2 violin strings tuned too tight. Dr. Wilson got straight to the point. "Your husband, Mrs. Carter, has a severe nervous disorder. He needs to be admitted to the sanitarium for proper treatment." "Sanitarium?" Mama repeated, horrified. "The madhouse. You mean psychiatric hospital is the correct term," the doctor patiently corrected. "He's having delusions, hallucinations, probably triggered by grief, but which can worsen if not treated. As for your daughter," he continued, glancing at me, "she needs prenatal care. She's anemic and malnourished." It was as if a bomb had exploded in that small room. Aunt Virginia put her hands on her hips, staring at her sister. "Martha, tell me it's not what I'm thinking." Mama collapsed in a chair, defeated. "What did you want me to do, Virginia? He's my husband, her father, and that gives him the right to." Aunt Virginia didn't finish the sentence, too horrified. She turned to the doctor. "Doctor, what happened to my niece? It's a crime, isn't it?" The doctor looked from one to the other, finally understanding what no one was saying openly. "If it's what I'm thinking, yes, it's one of the most serious crimes, and I report it. I'll call the police." Aunt Virginia continued, tears of anger in her eyes. You can," the doctor replied hesitantly. "But think about what this will mean for the young lady, for the baby that will be born." This kind of situation usually becomes comment. Gossip. "And what do you suggest?" my aunt asked, her voice trembling. "The man needs to be institutionalized, that's certain. We can do the hospitalization papers without mentioning the other matter. Just say that he has delusions, that he tried to burn down the house, that he represents a danger to himself and others. And so it was that on a rainy February morning in 1959, 2 men came to get my father. He didn't even resist. He was so immersed in his own madness that he hardly noticed what was happening. He got into the ambulance, looking at the sky, searching for something in the grey clouds, whispering James's name. When the ambulance turned the corner, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, as if I could finally breathe after months of suffocating. I looked at Mamma, expecting to see the same relief, but what I saw was something else. A mixture of guilt, shame, and what hurt me most, anger. Anger directed at me. "Satisfied?" she whispered when Aunt Virginia went into the house. "Now everyone will know. How could you do this to your own father?" I was speechless. How could she blame me? How could she defend that man after everything he had done? But I soon understood. Mama was a product of an era when women were trained from an early age to accept, to be silent, to endure. Men are like that. Women have to endure. You did something to provoke him. These were phrases I'd heard all my life. He raped his own daughter, Mama, I said quietly, using the right word for the first time for what had happened. And you knew. You let it happen. She slapped me across the face. The only one she ever gave me in my entire life. Never repeat that again. Your father is sick. He doesn't know what he's doing. Aunt Virginia appeared at the kitchen door, attracted by the shouts. If you hit her one more time, Martha, it's you who leave this house, not her. It was the beginning of a cold war that lasted for months. Mama barely spoke to me, as if I had betrayed the family by allowing father to be hospitalized. She spent the day crying in corners, visited him at the sanitarium whenever she could, came back saying he was improving, that he would soon return home to our family. Meanwhile, my belly was growing. Aunt Virginia took me to appointments with Dr. Wilson, bought me fabric to make maternity clothes, even began to prepare a cradle for the baby. To explain my situation to the neighbours and acquaintances. She invented a story that I was a widow, that my husband had died in a farm accident shortly after the wedding. In those days, being a widow was more acceptable than being an unwed mother. It was during one of these appointments, already in the 6th month of pregnancy, that Dr. Wilson gave me news that changed everything. Miss Elaine, you are expecting twins. I almost fell off the chair. Twins. 2 children to raise alone in a time when I could barely imagine how I would raise one. Are you sure, Doctor? Absolutely. You can hear 2 distinct little heartbeats. I left the office dazed, my hands on my belly, which now made more sense. Too big for the stage of pregnancy. Aunt Virginia, who was waiting for me in the waiting room, saw my face and immediately asked what had happened. It's 2, Auntie, 2 babies. She widened her eyes, made the sign of the cross, and then, to my surprise, opened a smile. God knows what he's doing, girl. It will be difficult, but we'll manage. That night, lying in the narrow bed I shared with Mama, who slept with her back to me as always, I felt the babies moving for the first time. It wasn't that weak tremor I'd already felt before. These were kicks, punches, complete somersaults, as if they were talking, playing in there. I cried silently, my hands on my belly, feeling my children alive, strong despite everything. At that moment, I made a decision. These children would never know the truth about how they were conceived. They would never carry the weight of that knowledge. I would invent a father for them, a good, hard-working man who had died before meeting them. A merciful lie to protect them from the terrible truth. Mama, whom I thought was asleep, suddenly spoke, still with her back to me. What are you going to do when these children are born, Elaine? How will you raise them? With what money? I don't know, Mama. I just know they're my children and I'll love them. And when your father comes back, what will you say to him? I felt a shiver down my spine. I hadn't thought of that. In the last few months I had almost managed to forget that father existed, that one day he could leave the sanitarium, return to our lives. He won't come back, Mama. Not to my life. Never again. She finally turned, her eyes shining in the darkness. He is your father, Elaine. His blood runs in your veins, in the veins of these children. There's no escape from that. Her words haunted me in the days that followed. What if she was right? What if there was no escape from blood, from inheritance, from the curse? What if my children were born already marked, condemned to repeat the errors of their father, grandfather? It was Aunt Virginia who saved me from this well of dark thoughts. Nonsense, she said, when I finally had the courage to share my fears. Blood curse is ignorant people's talk. What makes a person is character, choices, not blood. Look at me and your mother. Same parents, same upbringing, and we're as different as water and oil. But what if they're born different with some problem? If they are, we love them just the same, and take care of them, and teach them right from wrong, which is what your parents didn't know how to do with your father. At the end of July 1959, when Charleston was preparing for Independence Day, I felt the first contractions. It was 2 in the morning, and I woke with a pain that seemed to split my belly in half. Mama wasn't home. She had gone to spend a few days at the sanitarium with Father, who according to her was having a worse crisis than the previous ones. Aunt Virginia, always practical, had already arranged everything with an experienced midwife who lived 2 blocks down. In 20 minutes Mrs. O'Leary was at my side, examining me with calloused but gentle hands, guiding me through the pains that increased with each minute. "It's going to be a difficult birth, girl," she warned. "There are 2, and they're coming a bit sideways. You'll need strength." Strength was something I had learned to have in recent months. The 16 hours of labour that followed were the hardest of my life up to that point. But when I finally heard the cry of the first baby, followed minutes later by the second, it was all worth it. 2 boys, announced Mrs. Orry, placing the little ones wrapped in clean towels in my arms, strong as bulls, despite having come early. I looked at those red, wrinkled, perfect faces and saw no shadow of my father in them. Just new, pure life waiting to be written. I cried with relief, with joy, with fear, with everything together. "What will you name them?" asked Aunt Virginia, tears also streaming down her wrinkled face. I hadn't thought of names for boys. I was certain they would be girls for some reason. I looked at the 2, so alike and yet so different at the same time. Emmanuel and Samuel, I replied without thinking much. Bible names that meant God with us and heard by God. Because despite everything, I still wanted to believe that God hadn't completely abandoned me. In the days following the twins' birth, a strange peace settled in me, as if I finally understood that the brutal life I had lived until then had a purpose. To bring these 2 beings into the world, to care for them, protect them, love them. It was also when the idea of revenge began to grow in me, not a violent, bloody revenge, but something more subtle, more definitive, something that would free not only me, but also my mother and my children from the yoke of that man who had destroyed so many lives. The opportunity would come sooner than I imagined, and in a way I could never have predicted. But before it arrived, I would have to face my mother's last great silence, a silence that, unlike the others, would be eternal. The first months with the twins were a challenge greater than anything I had ever faced. Sleepless nights, crying that wouldn't stop, cloth diapers that needed to be washed and boiled every day, cracked breasts from nursing 2 hungry babies. But unlike the pains I carried before, these were pains that brought purpose, that made me stronger each day. Aunt Virginia was an angel during this time. Even with her advanced age, she would wake up in the middle of the night to help me with the boys, taught old tricks to calm colic, to make the babies burp, even invented a double sling so I could carry both at once when I needed to go to the market or to church. Mama returned from the sanitarium 3 weeks after the twins' birth. She entered the house silently, looked at the babies sleeping in the improvised cradle, and didn't say a word. She seemed older, more hunched, as if the weight of the world had doubled on her shoulders. "How is Father?" I asked, more out of politeness than interest. "Worse," she responded simply. "The doctors say there's no more hope, that he'll be institutionalized for the rest of his life." I felt such great relief upon hearing that. I was ashamed. After all, we were talking about my father, the man who raised me, whom I once loved and respected. But the truth is that the prospect of him never leaving that place, never being able to hurt us again, was like taking an enormous weight off my shoulders. "Did the doctor say anything else?" asked Aunt Virginia, bringing a coffee for her sister. Mama hesitated, glanced at me, then lowered her eyes to the coffee steaming in the china cup. "They said he has a disease in his brain that gets progressively worse, that one day he won't recognize anyone anymore or be able to take care of himself." "What disease is that?" I insisted, curious. "I don't remember the name exactly. Starts with a P or something." Years later, when I was working at the hospital, I discovered that it was probably general paresis, a neurological complication of advanced stage syphilis, a disease he must have contracted in his wanderings through the region's brothel, and which, untreated for years, ended up affecting his brain, contributing to the madness that had been fermenting in him since James's death. In those first months of 1960, with my children growing strong despite being born premature, I began to think about the future. I couldn't continue depending on Aunt Virginia's charity forever. I needed to work, earn my own money, provide a roof and food for my boys. That's when an opportunity arose at the city hospital. They needed young women to work as nursing assistants, washing patients, changing sheets, feeding those who were more debilitated. The work was hard and paid little, but it had one advantage. They offered a small room at the back of the hospital for employees who lived far away. Aunt Virginia encouraged me to try. "It will be good for you, girl. Learn a profession. Be independent. The boys stay with me while you work. Then we take turns." Mamma, on the other hand, was horrified by the idea. Working in the hospital with sick people, injuries, people dying, that's not work for a family girl. "And what do you suggest, Mamma? That I remain dependent on Aunt Virginia for the rest of my life? Or that I hastily find a husband to support not only me, but also 2 children who aren't even his?" She didn't respond, but I realized I had touched on a sensitive point. In her mind, the only dignified solution to my situation was to marry. But what man in those days would accept a woman with 2 small children with no known father? The chances were minimal, and even if some suitor appeared, it would probably be out of interest in the land that father still owned back home, land that was legally still his despite the hospitalization. I got the job at the hospital and started 2 weeks later. It was difficult at first, the smell of disinfectant, the patient's pain, the moans during the night. But I soon got used to it. I discovered I had a knack for it. Gentle hands to clean wounds, a firm but kind voice to calm the agitated, courage to face situations that made other employees faint. In 6 months, I had already been promoted to a real nursing assistant. One of the head nurses, Mrs. Olivia, took me under her protection. She was a lady in her 50s who had never married, dedicating her life to the profession. She taught me everything she knew: how to give injections, measure blood pressure, recognize symptoms of common diseases, calm difficult patients. "You have a gift, girl," she would say. "You could be a real nurse with a diploma in everything. There's a school in Richmond." The idea was planted in my head, but it still seemed too distant a dream. How would I study in Richmond with 2 small children to raise? Where would I get money for the school, for housing in a big city? The twins turned 1-year-old and were already babbling their first words, taking uncertain steps, holding on to furniture, filling the house with joy. Aunt Virginia adored them, called them my little grandsons, told stories, made cloth dolls for them to play with. Even Mamma, who initially barely looked at the babies, began to grow attached. I saw her once cradling Samuel, singing softly a lullaby she used to sing to me when I was little, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Despite everything, she was still my mother. It was during this time that I met Robert, a young pharmacist who had opened a small pharmacy near the hospital. He would always come to deliver medications to the ward, and we started talking. He was an educated, gentle man from a good family. Soon we were having dates, always accompanied, of course, as the custom of the time demanded. He knew about my situation, that I was a widow with 2 small children, and didn't seem to mind. "I admire your courage," he told me once as we walked in the park after Sunday Mass, raising 2 children alone, working at the hospital, facing people's prejudice. Not just any woman would do that. For a moment I allowed myself to dream. Maybe he was the fresh start I had been waiting for. Maybe we could form a family, him, me, Emmanuel and Samuel. A real family based on respect and affection, not on fear and abuse. But fate once again had other plans. On a cold May morning in 1961, I was called urgently to the ward. A new patient had arrived in serious condition. When I entered the room and saw who it was, my blood froze in my veins. It was Mama, pale as wax, bluish lips, breathing with difficulty. "What happened?" I asked the nurse attending to her. "Heart problem, it seems. Her sister brought her in, said she collapsed in the kitchen suddenly. I ran to her side, took her cold hand. "Mama, it's me, Elaine. Can you hear me?" She opened her eyes slowly, focused on me with difficulty. "Elaine, forgive me." "Forgive what?" "Mama, don't talk now. Rest. I need to tell you." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so debilitated. "Your father, he isn't." She didn't finish the sentence. Her eyes rolled back. Her entire body shook in a violent convulsion, and then she was still. The doctors tried to revive her, but it was too late. A sudden, massive heart attack, they said later, quick and with no chance of survival. I stood there holding her still warm hand, trying to understand what she wanted to tell me in her last moments. "Your father, he isn't what?" The incomplete phrase would haunt me for months, years, until I finally discovered the truth. She almost took to the grave. The funeral was simple, as James's had been, except this time it was raining, a fine drizzle that seemed like tears from heaven. Aunt Virginia cried a lot, clinging to my arm. The twins, too young to understand what was happening, stayed at home with a neighbour. After Mama's death, something changed inside me. It was as if a last cord that tied me to the past had broken. Now it was just me, my children, and whatever future we could build. And of course, one last matter to resolve. My father still institutionalised, still a shadow hanging over our lives. Aunt Virginia called me for a serious conversation a week after the funeral. "Elaine, there's something your mother asked me to tell you if anything happened to her. I promised I wouldn't speak while she was alive, but now I sat down, my heart racing. Could this be the continuation of that last sentence interrupted by death?" "It's about your father," she continued, her voice trembling. "About what he did to you." "You already know about that, Auntie." "It's not that. It's about who he really is." She paused as if gathering courage. "Henry is not your biological father, Elaine." It was as if the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. It wasn't possible. There had to be some mistake. "What do you mean? Of course he is. He always was." "Mamma, never. Your mother was 16 when she met a young man from the city, a law student who was on vacation in the area. They fell in love. And well, you know how these things happen. When your mother discovered she was pregnant, the young man had already returned to Richmond. Her family, my parents, were furious. They arranged a hasty marriage with Henry, who was a foreman on the neighbouring farm, and had an interest in the land my father would leave as inheritance. I listened to all of this as if in a dream or a nightmare. He agreed to marry her, knowing Mama was pregnant by another man. He agreed on the condition that no one would ever know the truth, that the child you would be registered as his daughter. And so it was done. And my real father, did he never know about me? Aunt Virginia shook her head sadly. Your mother tried to contact him when she found out she was pregnant, sent a letter, never got a response. Years later, we learned he had married a girl from a good family, become a judge, moved to Washington, D.C. 1,000 questions exploded in my head. Why had Mama never told me? Why keep this secret until death? And if my biological father was alive out there somewhere, not knowing he had a daughter, 2 grandsons, why had Mama never told me, especially after what happened? Aunt Virginia held my hands in hers, her eyes full of an ancient sadness. "I think it was shame, my child, and fear. Fear that you would blame her for hiding this. Fear that you would go looking for this man and discover that he never wanted to know about you. And then when Henry did what he did, I think she became even more afraid that you would think she had let it happen because he wasn't your real father." Suddenly everything made a new terrible sense. Father's hateful look when I was born a girl, when he was expecting a boy, his obsession with James, his only real son. The ease with which he crossed that forbidden line, violating the daughter he never truly considered his own. And Mamma, her silence, her guilt, her inability to protect me. Everything now had a new layer of meaning. It wasn't just fear of a violent husband. It was fear that a secret kept for decades would come to light. That night, alone in my little room at the back of the hospital, I cried all the tears I still had to cry. For the girl I was, for the mother I lost, for the father I never knew. for the children who now carried the blood of a man who wasn't even my real father. When the sun rose, an idea had formed in my head, an idea so perfect, so just, so deliciously vindictive that I almost smiled thinking about it. The revenge I had dreamed of for so long was now within my reach, and it would be more complete than I had ever imagined. To execute it, however, I would need help, and the right person for that had just entered my life. Robert, the young pharmacist who increasingly seemed interested in building a future with me despite my complicated past. What I didn't know was that my revenge would end up taking a turn that I couldn't have imagined, even in my wildest dreams, and that the price to pay would be much higher than I was prepared to accept. The revelation that Henry was not my biological father changed everything. It was as if a confusing puzzle finally showed its complete image. The pieces fit together. Why he always favoured James, why he looked at me with that disguised anger even when I was small, why he crossed that unforgivable line so easily. In his sick mind, I wasn't really his daughter. I was just the living proof of my mother's betrayal, an intruder in the family he was forced to accept. My plan for revenge was born from this revelation. It wouldn't be a bloody revenge. I wouldn't stain my hands as he had stained his soul. It would be something more sophisticated, more complete, something that would take from him the only thing that still mattered: his name, his inheritance, his legacy. Robert and I grew closer during this time. He was a different man from all I had ever known, educated, gentle, patient with my children. When I finally found the courage and told him my whole story, the real one, not the widow version everyone believed, I expected to see disgust, rejection. But what I saw was compassion and a righteous anger directed not at me but at Henry. "This man needs to pay for what he did," Robert said, holding my hands. "Not just to you, but to your mother, to the children. He's already paying," I replied, locked up in that sanitarium, losing his mind more and more. "But it's not enough. I want him to know he completely failed, that he left nothing in this world." Robert immediately understood what I meant. As a pharmacist, he knew doctors, lawyers, people who could help us with what we were planning. And so we began our journey to legally destroy the man who had destroyed my childhood. The first step was to find a lawyer in Richmond, Mr. Jennings, a childhood friend of Robert's. I explained my situation, the truth about my birth, the abuse I suffered, the twins who were born from that violence, my desire to cut any legal connection with Henry. "What exactly do you want, ma'am?" asked the lawyer after listening to everything in silence. "I want to change my name and my children's names. I don't want anything from that man, not the surname, not the land, not a penny of the money. I want it to be as if we never existed for him." Mr. Jennings explained it would be complicated. We would need to prove that Henry was not my biological father, which without a paternity test, a rare thing in those days, would be almost impossible. We would have to prove the abuse, which would mean exposing the whole story in court, subjecting myself to public scrutiny and judgment. "Are you sure you want to go through this, Miss Elaine? It will be painful, and the children, one day they'll grow up, ask questions." "I'm sure," I replied without hesitation. "I prefer that my children know the truth when they're old enough to understand, rather than grow up carrying the name of a monster." While we prepared the legal process, I continued working at the hospital. It was there that I met Dr. Thomas, a young doctor who came to work in the psychiatric ward. We soon became friends. I helped with his consultations. He taught me about mental illnesses, the new treatments. One afternoon, while we were talking about a patient, I mentioned that my father was institutionalized in a sanitarium in Charleston. "What a coincidence," he said. "I'm visiting that sanitarium next week. I'm doing research on treatments for chronic patients. What's his name?" I hesitated for a moment, but something told me I could trust this doctor, Henry Carter. "But he's not my father." "Not really." I told the whole story once again. Dr. Thomas listened attentively without judgment. "If I may be so bold, Miss Elaine, I think I can help with your legal process. It would be useful to have an updated medical report on Mr. Carter's mental state. I can do this assessment when I go to the sanitarium if you authorize it. It was as if fate was conspiring in my favour. A week later, Dr. Thomas returned from the sanitarium with news that exceeded all expectations. Mr. Carter is in an advanced state of paralytic dementia, probably caused by untreated syphilis. He barely recognises where he is, confuses people, has constant delusions. According to the nurses, he calls for James all the time, believing his son is alive, and comes to visit him. Did he ask about me or my mother? The doctor hesitated, as if pondering how much he should say. Actually, he doesn't remember you. When I mentioned your name, he asked who that was. When I explained you were his daughter, he became agitated, said he never had a daughter, only a son named James. That hurt more than I expected. Even after everything, a part of me still wanted to have existed for him, if only as an object of hatred. Being completely forgotten seemed worse somehow, but Dr. Thomas's report was crucial for our process. With the medical certification that Henry was permanently mentally incapacitated, incompetent, and with no prospect of improvement, we were able to move forward with the name change request without needing his consent. In September 1962, I finally received the news I had been waiting for. The judge had granted my request. My children and I could adopt a new surname. I chose Wilson, Robert's surname. It was as if I were honouring the only person who had truly supported me when I needed it most. Elaine Wilson, I repeated to myself, savouring each syllable. Emmanuel and Samuel Wilson. It sounded good, sounded clean, new, without the weight of the bloody history we carried before. But my revenge wouldn't be complete with just that. There was still the matter of the land, the material inheritance that Henry valued so much. The land where I grew up, where James was buried, where so many tragedies had occurred. A part of me just wanted to give it all up. I didn't want anything that had belonged to that man. But Robert, always practical, made me see that those lands could mean a better future for my children. And there was another consideration. If I completely gave up the lands, they would go to distant cousins of Henry, people who had never lifted a finger to work them, who would probably sell everything to the first interested party. With Mr. Jennings's help, we filed a process for the lands to be divided. One part, the part where the house and James's grave were, we sold to pay for Henry's medical and hospitalisation expenses. The rest would be held for my children when they came of age. In November 1962, news arrived that would put the final period on this story. Henry had died in the sanitarium, victim of pneumonia that his weakened body couldn't fight. He died alone, without family at his side, calling for a son who was no longer among the living. I didn't go to the funeral. I only sent a wreath of flowers without a card, without a message. It was the most I could do. A few months later, Robert asked me to marry him. He knew it would be difficult. Me with 2 small children, with a complicated past. Him from a good family, with a promising future ahead. But he insisted he didn't care what others would think. I want to build a life with you, Elaine, with you and your children. We can start over somewhere else if you prefer. I married Robert on a Sunday in April 1963 in a simple ceremony at the Charleston, Maine church. Aunt Virginia was the only family present on my side. Emmanuel and Samuel, almost 4 years old, were the page boys, carrying the rings with the comical seriousness that only children can maintain on formal occasions. 2 weeks later, we left for Louisville, where Robert had received an offer to manage a larger pharmacy. It was the chance to start over in a place where no one knew our history, where we could just be a normal family, a couple, and their 2 children. I never returned to West Virginia. I learned through letters from Aunt Virginia that the lands were sold, that the house gradually fell down, that new owners built something different in its place. Even James's grave ended up lost when the new owner decided to tear down the fences and plant corn across the entire property. The years passed. Robert was a wonderful father to Emmanuel and Samuel, who grew up calling him Dad without ever questioning. When they turned 12, I thought it was time to tell them the truth. Not all of it, of course, but a softened version. That their biological father had been a sick man who did bad things, who couldn't care for them. That Robert chose them as children of his heart, which was even more special than being a father by blood. They accepted it with the surprising naturalness that children sometimes have. "So, we have two fathers?" asked Emmanuel. "One who made us and one who raised us." I nodded, relieved to see they understood without drama. "I prefer the one who raised us," concluded Samuel, going back to playing as if that conversation hadn't been one of the most difficult moments of my life. In 1975, Aunt Virginia passed away at the age of 84. She was the last connection I had to my past in West Virginia. With her departure, I felt that a chapter was finally closing for good. I made an important decision that year. I went back to school, realizing the old dream of becoming a qualified nurse. Robert supported me as always, helping with the children, now teenagers, taking on more responsibilities at home so I could study at night. In 1978, at the age of 37, I finally received my diploma. It was one of the happiest days of my life. Life followed its course. The boys grew up, graduated. Emmanuel became an engineer. Samuel followed Robert's footsteps and became a pharmacist. Both married, gave me grandchildren who became the joy of my old age. Robert and I built a quiet life based on respect and companionship, so different from the turbulent marriage of my parents. In 1993, I lost Robert to a devastating cancer. It was an immense pain, but different from others I'd felt. It was a clean pain without guilt, without regrets. We had lived well, loved well, built something good together. Today, at 84 years old, looking back, I see that my revenge was more complete than I could have imagined. I didn't need to lift a finger against Henry. Life itself took care of punishing him. With the disease he himself sought in his escapades, with the loneliness of his last days, with the forgetfulness that covered his name and memory. He wanted so badly to leave a legacy, to have his name perpetuated through a son. In the end, his name died with him. His biological grandchildren, the children of the daughter he despised because he believed she wasn't his, carry another surname, call another man father, built brilliant lives without ever knowing the evil that carried in the blood running through their veins. If there is justice in this world, this was it. Not in the direct bloody revenge I dreamed of so many times when I was young, but in the complete erasure of a man who thought his name and his blood were so important. My name is Elaine Wilson, and this was my story. If it touched your heart in any way, please leave your like so others can know it too. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, as each message makes me feel I'm not alone sharing this heavy burden. And subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel to follow